What the heck is a dry fly? And what do you even use a nymph for? And aren't streamers like party decorations? So why would you even fish with those? If you found yourself asking those questions, you're not alone. The world of flies can be incredibly confusing, especially for a beginner. I mean, there's something like 2 billion flies on the market and 85,000 new ones introduced every single day. There's not, of course, but you get my point. On this episode of Untangled, we're going back to the basics to explore the fundamentals behind the flies that we use to catch fish. You're going to learn all about dry flies and streamers and nymphs, what those imitate, and when you want to use each one. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. This week on the show, we're going to spend the first part of it talking all about flies. We're going to go all the way back to the basics, the very beginning of the stuff that a lot of us learned about flies when we got into fly fishing. And we're going to talk all about the different types of flies. And then we're going to look at some information to pick the right one, regardless of whether regardless of where or when you're fishing. Now, for those of you who are further into the sport, who maybe you can tell your dry fly from your streamer, right? This is going to be a review, but it's good review because it's always good to go back and look at the basics, look at the building blocks of what we're doing to make sure we really understand it. Because if there's one thing that we know about fly fishing, it's that understanding as much about the sport as possible is going to translate into more success on the water. The greater understanding you have of why things are the way they are, the more success you're going to have out there on the water, more fish you're going to catch, the happier you're going to be, the better your life's going to be. You're going to walk with a spring in your step because you're catching fish, dadgummit, and not everybody is doing that. Really, you look at it for a minute, and it's a very eclectic pastime that we've taken up here, chasing trout on fly rods or whatever fish you're chasing. It's a unique thing. So take some pride in that. Take some pride in being unique. You're not part of the unwashed masses. You are different. All right, I'll get off my soapbox of that's my if I was ever to be a motivational speaker, a la Matt Foley, that would be part of my speech, I think. But before we get into the specific types of bugs, like talking about, okay, this is a dry, this is a nymph, and this is a streamer, we need to understand what those bugs are imitating and what those bugs are based on, and that would be aquatic insects, right? The whole point of flies is the aquatic insects in the first place. Without the aquatic insects, we don't really have a need for flies. That's the whole reason we use them, is we are trying our best to imitate the aquatic insects, because aquatic insects, and I'll just define this real quick for you. Aquatic insect is a bug that is born and raised, for lack of a better phrase, in the water. They hatch in the water, they live a good portion of their life in the water, and then they return to the water to lay their eggs. That's the definition of an aquatic insect. Now, we did have an entomologist, which that's the study of insects, I believe. That's the fancy term for it. But we had an entomologist in the comments a while ago get on me for interchangeably using insects and bugs, and they were good-natured about it. It wasn't one of those bad YouTube comments like, well, actually, that's not an insect, that's a bug. It wasn't one of those. They were good-natured about it. But if I use bug and insect interchangeably, I'm talking about the same thing. I'm just trying not to say aquatic insect 5,000 times in the show, because then we start to tune all the information out. So just bear that in mind. But the whole reason that we use flies to fish with, it's not because we're trying to make it harder than it needs to be, or we just want to be different. It's because we are trying to imitate the food sources that are in the water. Aquatic insects live in the water, fish live in the water, and so the fish are going to snack on those aquatic insects. Trout primarily, but bass and carp are going to eat aquatic insects too. So it's not just trout. This information is going to work for bass and carp as well. But fish are going to eat the bugs that live in the water. That's just part of the life cycle. That's how, we've all seen The Lion King. That's how it goes. Fly fishing's goal is to present a fake version of those bugs in a way that looks lifelike and natural so that we can fool a fish into eating it. We can act all macho, take a picture, put it on the gram, and go about the rest of our day. So there are 4 major types of aquatic insects that we're trying to imitate. I'm not going to get into every type. There's a lot more nuance to this, but for the sake of the beginner, right? If you're coming into this eyes wide open, this is the first fly fishing podcast you've clicked on YouTube or listened to on Spotify or Apple or wherever else you get your podcast. First off, I mean, you're welcome. This is the greatest fly fishing podcast on the planet. I'm not really biased, but I mean, we're also the only one that promises to remain ad-free forever unless Coca-Cola comes knocking, in which case we'll take their money. I've got a small love affair with Diet Coke. If you're new to the show, you'll learn that really quick. Diet Coke and wings. That's how you get to my heart. And anyways, I apologize for the tangent. We've got these 4 main types. For the beginner, if you are brand new to this is what you need to know just to build your foundational knowledge. You'll learn more as you dive deeper into this, but this is a great place to start building that foundational knowledge. So those 4 types of aquatic insects that we're trying to imitate with our flies would be a caddis, a mayfly, a midge, or a stonefly. That's it. Now, if you don't know what those are, if you've never heard those phrases before, don't worry. We actually have a lot of resources here at VFC to help you identify those and to learn more about them. And you do not need to be any kind of an expert on those types of bugs to understand the points that we are making here today. I'll link some of those resources in the show notes, so you can go click those, take a look at them as well. But with all of these bugs, with the exception of stoneflies, so caddis, mayflies, and midges, they share a very similar life cycle. And that life cycle is important because all the different flies that we use in fly fishing, the reason that we have so many different patterns, we're a creative bunch. We like to try new things and try different things out. But the main reason that we have so many different patterns out there is we are trying to imitate different parts of the life cycle of these bugs. Now, there are generally 3 stages of a bug's life that we are trying to imitate with our flies. The first would be the nymph, and then the emerger, and then the dry stage. Now, those are not the technical terms, but that's what we're going to call them just for sake of simplicity and for being able to easily identify them when you're buying flies or picking them out of your box so you know which ones to tie on, right? In the simplest terms, almost all of the bugs that fish eat are going to start their life in the water. That's why they're called aquatic insects, like we touched on earlier. The exception to this, of course, would be our terrestrial bugs, which are ones that are born and die and breed on land. Things like grasshoppers, cicadas, crickets, ants, and beetles. Those would be terrestrials. But they can get blown into the water. They can fall into the water, and trout love them. It is, what day is it? It's towards the end of July as I'm actually recording this podcast, and the hopper fishing is starting to just take off because there's tons of grasshoppers out right now. They're reaching their mature stage and they're being blown into the river, and the trout are just going nuts for them. So that's one example of a terrestrial insect. But we're not really focused on those right now. We're focused just on the aquatic side of things. Now, these aquatic insects, they all start their life in what we commonly refer to as the nymph stage. Now, we could get technical and we could talk about how, well, this one's actually a larva and this one's a pupa. We don't need to get that technical. You're more than welcome to dive into that if you want, but we're just going to call it the nymph stage. That's what we call the fly, so we're going to call it the nymph stage. Now, technically, like I said, they might be called larva or pupa, but that doesn't matter. So if you hear those terms thrown around, that's still referring to a nymph at some point. Now, aquatic insects are going to spend a good portion of their life as a nymph. Living in the water, they're often going to live on the bottom of the river. They are readily available to fish at this stage of their life to the point that there's so many nymphs in the water and they're so easily available to fish to eat that almost 90% of a trout's diet is made up of nymphs. They love to eat nymphs. They're like me at the all-you-can-eat buffet, and I'm loading up on the rolls, okay? Because if there's one thing I've learned about all-you-can-eat buffets, don't do the prime rib, okay? It's always going to disappoint you. When you order medium rare steak, it's going to be medium crap and shoe leather. And the wings, I love wings, but I've never been to a buffet with good wings, unfortunately. So if anybody knows of a buffet with good wings, please point me in that direction. I would love to go visit. Where was I? The nymphs, right? They're readily available. There's so many of them. They're like the buffet. It's about 90% of a trout's diet. As much as we might love the idea of catching fish on dry flies, and for a lot of us, that's what attracts us to the sport in the first place. We see anglers out there catching fish on dry flies, and that looks like so much fun. It is, but fish eat off the top like 10% of the time. Most of the food they eat are going to be those nymphs underneath the water. Now, when those nymphs, when they're ready to grow up, they're ready to become adults, they're getting their own ideas. They bought their little midge Camaro, right? They're ready to go off and make their own way in the world. They will start moving from the bottom of the river. They're going to go up towards the surface to hatch. Now, all aquatic insects, when they go from being a nymph to the dry fly, they're going to enter a stage that we call the emerger. That is every insect except the stonefly. Okay, and I'll get into stoneflies in just a second. But all the other bugs, so midges, caddis, and mayflies, they enter this emerger stage. It's like their adolescent stage. They're awkward, they're self-aware, they look kind of funny, they're not sure where they fit in. They're undergoing a transformation here where they grow wings and they become adult enough to go out and make more bugs. Stoneflies don't do this, though. Stoneflies, they just leave the river. They just kind of crawl up out of the river. They shed their nymphal skin. It's called a shuck. And then they're ready to go. They can go make more stoneflies. Stoneflies only have 2 life cycle stages. They're just a nymph, and then they become the adult. Really, really simple. Really easy. We love stoneflies for that. Once the rest of the bugs, though, once they have gone through that emerger stage, they've fully formed their wings, they're adults, and they're sometimes we call that the done stage. At this point, they are ready to leave the water to mate, and they're going to do that. They're going to fly around, and this is when we call them the dry fly. The dry flies that you see at your fly shop or local big box store, that's what those imitate. The dry flies are imitating this point of an aquatic insect's life. When it is adult, it's ready to go and make more bugs. Okay. At this point, like we said, they're going to leave the water to mate, and then they're going to return to the water to lay their eggs and die. They die. I hate to burst your bubble, but they die. Again, that life cycle, pretty simple. Nymph, emerger, and then dry fly. So when you hear different patterns described as, oh, this is a great nymph, or that's a sneaky good emerger pattern, that's what they're referring to. It's all about imitating the bugs during a given stage of their normal life cycle. So we know what we're trying to imitate with a certain bug. We're trying to hit a life cycle stage, but how do we know when to use that? Like, when should we use a nymph instead of a dry fly? And what about streamers? I mentioned streamers. I told you we were going to get into them. Let's talk about streamers, then I'll give you a use case for each type of fly. Streamers are meant to imitate other food sources in the river, like leeches or small fish like minnows, shiners, sculpin, or even small trout and bass, because fish will eat other fish, and streamers can trigger that predatory response in fish as well. If you are coming into fly fishing from spin or bait casting, then you understand the function of a lot of lures isn't so much to look like an exact replica of a food item as much as it is to trigger that aggressive response and get a fish to just come smack it, either because they're upset or they're like, oh yeah, that actually does look good. Yeah, hey Bob, get me some Tabasco for this, will you please? You know, they're either in that mode, but usually it's that predatory response. Streamers are going to function very similarly to that. Even if fish aren't hungry, okay, a lot of streamers are just tied to get the attention of fish more so than to imitate a specific type of fish. So that's what streamers are, and that's what they're trying to do. Now, let's take a look at when we would want to use each one of these. Okay, I mentioned earlier, we'll start with nymphs. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, an enormous amount of a fish's diet is subsurface. They are going to eat tons of nymphs. So fishing nymphs is going to be your best bet most of the time for hooking into fish. I like to give Alex a hard time here at VFC because we'll go out fish together and he's got a nymph rig on and I've got a dry fly rig on and we're always just poking fun at each other. But he often outfishes me because fish eat more nymphs than they do dry flies. So, joke's on me, I guess. Uh, but it's going to be a really good, it's going to give you the best opportunity to catch fish if you are fishing a nymph rig. Okay, that's just the reality of it. Now, let's say you show up to the river or you show up to the water and you're ready to rig your rod up and get going, but you don't see any fish rising. And by fish rising, I mean you don't see any rings on the surface of the water, or you don't see fish jumping out of the water to eat bugs. Okay, you don't see the telltale signs that fish are up and eating on the surface. If you don't see that, then it's a really good idea to set up a nymph rig and fish with that, because chances are the fish are feeding on nymphs. They're not focused on any dry flies at that point if you don't see them rising. We actually have a video on setting up a nymph rig. I'll go ahead and link that in the show notes so you can see exactly how to set that nymph rig up. But that's one situation in which using nymphs would be a great way to go. Now, let's say you get to the water and you actually see fish rising, in which case, congratulations. You're about to have the most fun you can have on a fly rod. Okay, that's just my opinion. I think dry flies are the most fun. But that's also what's kind of cool about fly fishing is you can really personalize your experience out there. You can do what you like the most and catch fish that way. For me, that happens to be dry flies. I love watching a fish coming up and eating a fly off the surface. I love the visual aspect of it. I love the challenge of getting the drift right. There's just a lot that I love about it. But anyways, you get to the water. There's some fish rising. This is a great time to tie on a dry fly. Now, sometimes the fish are going to be rising and they're actually eating emergers instead of dry flies. It can be really frustrating because the fish, if you just tie a dry fly on them, they're actually eating emergers. And remember, the emerger is that adolescent, like that weird adolescent stage of the aquatic insect's life. But if they're eating emergers and you throw a dry fly out there, the fish are probably going to refuse it. It's really frustrating because you're like, they're rising and I got a dry on. Why aren't you eating, fish? Well, what you've got to do is pay attention to how the fish are actually rising. Okay, this is what we call a rise form. When a fish comes up and eats off the top of the surface, if you see its nose break the surface or you see a small splashy rise, that usually means they're eating the dry fly. If you see a rise and you don't see the nose of the fish break the surface, you only see the dorsal fin and the tail fin or part of the back of the fish break the surface, that means they're eating emergers. So that's the way to tell the two apart. But rigging up a dry fly is really simple, and you guessed it, we've got a video on rigging up dry flies. I will throw a link to that in the show notes as well, so you can see how that's done if you're ready to move on. And then streamers are a great choice in the spring and in the fall, because those are times when fish are aggressively eating. In the spring, they just came out of that winter. They want to pack the pounds on. They're hungry. Right, there's actually food in the winter or in the water again. So they're going, they're crazy, they're having fun, snacking up in the spring. In the fall, they are preparing to go into the winter, so they're going to be again packing the pounds on. They'll be very aggressive. Spring and fall is a great time to fish streamers. If you get to the river during spring or fall and you don't see any fish rising, a streamer can be a great way to put a few fish in the net. If you don't want to fish nymphs that day, or if you just want to switch things up. Now, you can fish streamers year-round, and they're a great option on lakes as well. But if we're just talking about rivers and when you'd want to fish them, I focus a lot of my streamer fishing in the spring and in the fall. That's when I have the most luck with it, and that's when I like to do it, because the rest of the time I'm fishing dry flies or I'm fishing nymph rigs. But streamers have their place for me. That's how I delineate them, though, in my mind. And yes, we do have a video on how to rig up a streamer, and I'll throw that in the show notes as well. Now, as you can probably tell, there's tons more that we could dive into on the topic of flies and picking flies and how to tell them apart and which one's going to be the best pattern for a given situation. We've got tons of episodes of Untangled, some episodes in our masterclass that go into this. So if you just look on YouTube or browse the podcast episodes in whatever podcast app you use, you'll find some other resources on this. We also have a fly selection masterclass that is coming out soon. It's not quite out yet. Me and Alex have been spending the last, feels like forever, working on it. But we have an entire masterclass that's going to be out that you'll be able to go and look at as well. And that'll dive into bugs in detail. That'll take this and just go a mile deep on every single topic. But for starters, this is a great way to get familiar with the bugs and what they're supposed to imitate. And with that, folks, hopefully you found something informative and helpful in that section of the show. If there's anything about bugs that you still have questions on or you need clarification on, please reach out to me. There's always a way to contact us somewhere in the show notes, I believe. Hit us up on social media as well. I'd be happy to clarify anything if you need it. And we are ready to move on to the next section, the Q&A section of this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
If you're new to Untangled, every week we do a Q&A section where we take questions from the listeners and I give you my 2 cents on them. The whole show really is based on questions that we get from people. The beginning part of the show that I do every week is almost always in response. Well, not almost. It's always in response to questions. I just take a question that we received recently or a concept that people are asking about, and I go really deep on it for the first part of the show. And then I take some other questions and just kind of go through them here in the Q&A section of the show. So that's what we're doing. And if you've got a question that you would like answered, please don't hesitate to send those on in. There's always a link in the podcast description to submit those questions to us. And with that, we will get started with Nathan from Ohio. Writes in, got our first question, says, apologies, this has already been asked as I discovered the podcast not too long ago, but which relatively large U.S. cities would you recommend moving to for easy access to trout fishing? Some factors would include quick access, fishing pressure, and scenery. I will be moving out of Ohio soon, and I am trying to decide where to go. Denver seems to be quite busy with lots of people fishing, so curious if you have any other insight. Feel free to not answer if people will get mad about you blowing up their spot/city, but I'm from Wisconsin, and I know they have some great fishing there, so I'll give that up. Anyways, love the pod, and on behalf of all the newbies out there, thanks for everything you've taught us. Nathan, thank you. Appreciate the kind words. Thanks for the question. Appreciate you sending it in. Denver's trash. I'll die on that hill. Yeah, it's crowded, it's loud, and it's not close to the mountains at all. Granted, I grew up in Utah, where our cities actually are close to the mountains, like right next to them. Unlike Denver, it's all the way out on the plain. Okay, I'm kidding. Okay, Denver's not trash. You got to get the dig in when it presents itself, right? Of all the bigger cities that I've been to, and I've been to quite a few big. I lived in New York City for a while. You could not pay me to go back to New York City, by the way, but Denver's not that bad. You couldn't pay me to live there either, though. Denver's just got more people in it than all of Wyoming, so I'm gonna keep my wide open spaces because I like not being around too many people. But kidding aside, Denver's not that bad. It's not a bad place to set up shop if you want to fish. You're not as close to the mountains as it would seem, or as people in Denver would like to make it seem. It's a bit of a drive to get there. But if you're in the suburbs anyways, you're close enough. I hesitate to say that you're going to have easy access to trout fishing if you live in a large U.S. city, because I don't consider dealing with traffic to be easy. So, I mean, even with how close the mountains are to towns in Utah, it's an absolute pain in the butt to get to the water there. So I live in Wyoming, and VFC is headquartered in Utah. And I'm down in Utah at least once a month, usually more, working with Alex and the rest of the VFC team. And we'll go fishing when we're done with work. And, we're right there. We're in Orem. We're right across the highway from the mountains. And it still takes like 45 minutes to get to the river. It's ridiculous. Oh, anyways, I don't do well with traffic. Billings, Montana wouldn't be a bad choice. There's, 120,000 people in Billings. I don't know if that counts as large. But you've got relatively decent fishing not too far from Billings. Bozeman and Missoula, but those are probably both smaller. They're also in Montana. They wouldn't be bad options. Spokane, Washington puts you in a good spot. I don't know how big Spokane is off the top of my head, but there's like 8 or 9 freeway exits when I drove through last time. So that's my definition of big. I mean, where I live in Wyoming, I'm 2.5 hours from the nearest interstate. So I'm you gotta get lost to find me. It's kind of nice. Glenwood Springs, Colorado. That's on the smaller side, but does Glenwood Springs have a Walmart? They've got a Wendy's, so they're a big city to me. Oh, Glenwood Springs wouldn't be bad. Just about any city near the Sierra Nevada in California is going to be a good option as well. There's a lot of good fishing in the Sierra Nevada if you don't mind other people. But most of the places that I would recommend, hey, if you want to get serious about trout fishing, you want to live somewhere with great trout fishing, they don't have a Walmart. They don't have fast food like Ennis, Island Park, Dillon, Loa. None of those. Well, Dillon's got a McDonald's and a Dairy Queen. I know that because me and Alex were in Dillon in March, and we ate at the Dairy Queen. We didn't eat at the McDonald's because we have standards. Well, Alex does. I don't. I'll eat a Big Mac. But anyways, Helena, Helena, Montana is not a bad spot either. Again, I don't know how many people live in Helena, but it's not that bad. The mean streets are rough, though. You might watch yourself. The mean streets of Helena, they can be tough. I'm sure there's tons of great spots back east too, but other than I lived in New York City for a little bit, and then I've spent a little bit of time in Buffalo and Niagara. That's really my experience with being back east, so I'm not going to pretend that I know what I'm talking about. I was really impressed with Buffalo and Niagara, though. It was a lot of fun, and there's some good trout fishing. The Niagara River was a lot of fun. I had a blast doing that. In fact, I'm trying to put a trip together to go back there because I had so much fun with it. But my best advice is pick a general area that you like and then settle down in the town that best suits your needs. So for me, I wanted to be in Wyoming and I wanted to be far away from people. So I found a place and I made it happen. And there's 1,000 people in the town that I live in. It's an hour to Walmart from here. The nearest fast food's a half hour away. We're 2.5 hours from Lowe's and Home Depot. And our nearest movie theater has 4 screens. So, it's a big trade-off, but the hunting and fishing is incredible. Best hunting and fishing ever. The trade-offs have been worth it to me. They're not to most people, though. So you do got to keep that in mind if you're going to run into trout country and want to do it. And, I could have put Jackson or something on the list here, but who can freaking afford Jackson, right? And Glenwood Springs can't afford Bozeman. You can't afford half these places anymore. Sadly, that's the truth of it. If there was trout fishing in the Midwest, man, that'd be perfect because that's the only place where houses are still relatively cheap. And I know there's trout fishing in the Midwest. I mean, like Rocky Mountain trout fishing in the Midwest, but then it wouldn't be the Midwest. And when we get in a whole geographical existentialism there, we should probably just move on from the question. But I appreciate you sending that in. Thanks a bunch. Jason from Idaho's got our next question. Writes in and says, Spencer, like most, I fish the same rivers every year up here in North Idaho and Western Montana. Certain stretches have become very familiar, and with that familiarity comes the knowledge of what time of year makes for the best river conditions that allow me to fish upstream, crisscrossing at all the right spots. What lessons have you learned over the years about safely crossing the river and judging the strength of the current in shallower runs versus slow but deep pockets where you're on your tiptoes to get through a deep, slow channel? Jason, this is a timely question. Thanks for sending it in because I about went in the drink last week. Me and Alex were out filming for our upcoming fly selection masterclass, and we had to cross this river. It's, I don't know, 30-ish feet, maybe 40 feet across. I'm terrible at estimating that kind of stuff, but it's a bigger river, and it's pretty steep gradient, and really loose stream bed. It's all just big rocks on the stream bed. There's no firm ground or anything. So it was really tough wading. And Alex goes across it. Alex has, I think he's got 3 inches on. I think he's 6'2" and I'm 5'11". So I think he's got 3 inches on me. He might have 4. I can't remember. I'm fatter than him though. So I got that on him. Anyways, he crossed the river just fine. He's a little bit better wader than I am. I've got terrible balance and horrible ankles, so I'm just a lot slower at my wading. But I got into that and I got about halfway across and the water was almost up to my waist and the rocks kept moving under my feet. And I was convinced the next step I took was going to send me in the drink, which wasn't good because I had my backpack full of camera gear on and it wasn't my waterproof backpack. So I knew I couldn't go into the drink. I didn't mind getting wet. That would have been fine, to be honest with you. But I couldn't get the camera gear wet. So it was really tough. I made it across, but it took a while, and there were more than one occasion where I was convinced I was going in the drink. So before I give out any tips about this, I do need to say wading a river is inherently dangerous, and for legal reasons, I'm not advocating that anyone try anything they're not comfortable with. Okay, legal stuff out of the way. For me, my personal cutoff is that I'm not going to wade across a bigger river if it gets to more than waist deep. A smaller river, if it gets more than waist deep, I can usually reach the other bank fairly quickly. But if it's a bigger river and I can't get to the other bank quickly, I'm not going to go in if it gets above my waist, if the current is fast enough that I'm actively struggling to stay upright. I know that sounds pretty subjective, but I think a lot of this with wading certainly qualifies as subjective. Look at that instance with Alex that I just described, for example. The water never got over my waist. It was just about to my waist. But even though the current was really strong and the rocks were crazy, as slippery as a politician trying to get out of taking accountability for anything, I still felt confident enough that I could wade because it wasn't over my waist deep. Now, I about bailed a couple of times and just told Alex to have fun, but I made it across. If it had gotten over my waist, though, I would have just bailed and backed out and figured somewhere else to cross the river. Now, as far as judging the current speed, the only way to really see how hard it's going to be to wade out into that river is just get out into the river a little bit. If the current is too tough for you to wade and you're only a few feet from shore, it's just going to get worse the further out that you walk. It also depends a lot on what the riverbed is like as well. If the riverbed is stable and it's not slippery, then I will handle a swifter current because I've got better footing. But if I'm, that's what usually gets me. Sorry, I wrote some notes down on this and I lost my place on them. That's what usually gets me into trouble when I'm wading, is if I lose my footing. I can handle the deeper stuff, even up to chest deep. I'll do it if the footing's good and the current's not too strong. But if not, that's when I tend to bail because, again, I don't have the best balance. I've got bad ankles. I don't know why my ankles suck. They just do. It's kind of frustrating. Anyways, what I think it boils down to is keep your balance and not going past what you're comfortable with. I'll also say that if you're in faster water and it's a bigger river, if you can, try to move from boulder to boulder if they're sticking up out of the water, because there's always going to be a pocket of nice calm water behind those boulders, and that's a great place to either reestablish your footing, look and see where you're at, or even just take a break from the hassle of walking in the river. So that's my 2 cents. Hopefully that's helpful, Jason, and if you got any questions or need some follow-up on that, don't hesitate to reach out. Jack from Wisconsin has our next question, writes in and says, fly rod in hand for 2 years, still struggle with mending. Any tips for mending your line with 2 different current speeds? For example, a riffle with faster water with a deep pool in the back where the fly lands, the fast current pulls the fly line, and the fly pulls unnaturally. Jack, thanks for the question. So the exact situation that you described makes me think that you actually need to high stick your drift instead of mending. Because if the fly is landing in a pool of slower water, but there's fast water where your fly line lands, then a mend isn't really going to help you out much. You need to get your fly line off the water completely, and you do that by high sticking. And for those who don't know, high sticking is the act of when your fly lands, let's say you're fishing pocket water. It's a great way to visualize it. And you want to land your fly in a very small pocket, and there's a lot of turbulent water all around it. If you just made a normal cast and let your fly line sit in there, your fly would land in that calm pocket for about a millisecond, and then it would be yanked out by all the other current. Now, when you high stick, you just land it and lift your rod up really high so that the only thing on the water is your fly and maybe a couple inches of tippet, if that, right? you have all your fly line and most of your leader and tippet off the water. That's what high sticking is. It's a valuable skill. It's very good for getting a natural looking drift through water where you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Now, let's still, though, Jack, I want to talk about mending because it's an important skill. Everybody needs to know how to mend. And for those who don't know, mending is just the fancy name that we give for moving your fly line so that it doesn't cause drag on your flies or your indicator. Mending is often associated with fishing with nymphs, but you'll need good mends with dry flies and dry dropper rigs too. I'm going to refer to mending with an indicator because, again, that's where most mending tends to take place. Well, I shouldn't say most. I think that's where most of us learn our mends in the first place is with nymphing. So I'm going to refer back to a nymphing scenario to help teach this, just because I think if we're familiar with it, it'll be easier to understand. So the idea behind mending is that you are going to lift and move your fly line without moving that indicator. You're moving that fly line to a place where it won't cause any drag on the indicator. Often, when we're dealing with nymph rigs, that means you're mending your line to sit above the indicator instead of below it. Because if you're casting, let's say I'm standing in the river and I'm going to fish this run and the run is 20 feet away from me, okay? Between me and the run, is the current always going to be moving at the same speed? Probably not, okay? So what is going to happen if I make that cast and I just throw my indicator into that run and I just don't do anything to my fly line? If the current is quicker between me and where my indicator landed, the current's going to grab my fly line and pull it and cause my indicator and my nymph to drag. That's not a natural presentation. The fish are going to spot that. They're going to say, not today, and they're not going to bite. Okay. Now, if the water between me and my indicator is slower, again, it's just going to pull back on the indicator so that it doesn't look like a natural drift. When you mend, you're trying to get your fly line and your indicator moving all together at the same speed so that it's a natural drag-free drift. That's the goal behind a mend. The problem that I see a lot of anglers have with mending is they look at it as almost another casting move instead of the just literal pick up, move your line move that it is. And that can cause their mends to either not be enough, like I threw a mend and they barely move their line, or they're going to mend way too much and they move the indicator and they either move the indicator all the way out of where they wanted it to drift in the first place, or they move it so violently that the fish are going to be like, well, that nymph just shot that way 8 feet. That's not natural. Nymphs don't move that quick. So what you need to visualize is the mend is just a literal lift and move of your fly line. You raise the tip of your rod, get the line off the water, and then you briskly move the rod, often with a flick of your wrist, to make the fly line move to where it needs to be. Now, that's kind of tough to explain over the podcast. Hopefully that made sense, but mending is a concept that is best seen explained. So I highly recommend you check out our video on mending, which I'll link in the show notes. I definitely want to take a look at that. But if you've got any other questions about mending, Jack, or anybody else, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'd love to help you out with them. And coming up next, folks, is our Live Real Life moment. The Live Real Life moment is your opportunity to share your successes, your experiences, your fun, your stories from out on the water. We are built on creating great experiences. That's what we do here at VFC. We want you to have a great time out on the water, and we want to hear about it. We want to hear about those awesome success stories. So if you have a story about living real life, then please share it with us. We love to share them, and we share a new one every week on the podcast. There's a link in the podcast description to send those Live Real Life moments in, and please send them in via that link. I'm not going to be able to use them if they get sent in elsewhere. I need them sent in via that link. It keeps everything nice and organized for me. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment, please send them in via the link. And this week's Live Real Life moment, it's a shorter one, but Chris sent it in, and he's got a picture that accompanies it. So the picture's up on the screen right now if you're watching the video podcast. And if you're listening to it, I've thrown the picture in the show notes so you can go take a look at it as well. But this is what Chris said. He said, This was a beautiful little brook trout that was the first fish I caught on a fly that I tied personally. It was in a high alpine creek after we had spent all day fishing the 4 lakes above this creek with very little luck. The hike up to those lakes was extremely difficult, all above 11,200 feet in elevation. We started the day at 4 a.m. and ended up at the creek at about 4 p.m. The creek was just loaded with these beautiful little guys and well worth the whole rest of the day of not being a very successful time. Well, Chris, that's awesome. Congrats, man. It's funny how that you go up into the high country and sometimes you're like, oh, the fish are going to basically throw themselves in my net. It doesn't always turn out that way. But when you can get into a little creek like that with those brookies, and that's a gorgeous little fish, by the way, man. Congrats. Thanks for sending that question. Thanks for sending your story in. I really appreciate it, Chris. Thank you. And that's going to do it this week for us, folks. We appreciate you taking the time to sit down and be part of the VFC community. Love what we're doing here at VFC and at Untangled. If there's anything we can do to help you fish, help you to have a better day out on the water, please let us know. That's what we're here for. If you have any questions at all that you would like answered on the show, there's always a link to submit those questions in the podcast description. If you've got a live real life moment to share, send that in via the link in the podcast description as well. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, have some fun, soak up the rest of summer, and tie lines, everybody.